Welcome to Culture Over Coffee, a podcast focused on improving company culture and fostering employee engagement. Every week, we chat with experts and thought leaders about the latest proven practices to reduce regrettable turnover, increase productivity, and retain key customers. So pour a cup of your favorite brew and join us. I'm your host, Beth Sunshine, SVP at Up Your Culture. In this episode, we're digging into the real cost of silence in the workplace and what it takes to build a culture where people feel safe, heard, and empowered. You'll soon see that when employees feel like they can't be their authentic selves at work, the impact goes far beyond quiet meetings and silent Slack threads. Joining me to explore this critical issue is Mindy Murphy, culture coach here at Up Your Culture. Mindy makes a ton of great points, like how when employees aren't comfortable speaking up, leaders can have a false sense of harmony while resentment builds over time. Why the most respected leaders aren't those who claim to know it all, but those who are open enough to keep asking better questions. And finally, why creating a space for candor requires courage. Well, Mindy, I have been looking forward to this conversation as a talent analyst and a culture coach. I know you deeply understand what it takes to build workplaces where people feel safe to speak up, where they show up, where they fully contribute. So I'm really excited for today's conversation. I know it's going to give leaders a lot to reflect on. Thank you for joining me. I want to start with the Engage 2025 report and a finding that sort of stopped me in my tracks, that half of employees don't feel they can be their authentic selves at work. Striking. I want to know from you, what does that say about the state of psychological safety in today's workplace, and how did we get here?
Yeah, well, it's a stark indicator of a widespread lack of psychological safety, I would say, in many workplaces. Psychological safety refers to an environment where people feel safe to express themselves or share ideas or voice concerns or admit mistakes without that fear of judgment or punishment or negative consequences. So when half of the workforce feels the need to mask their identity, I think that reflects a deeper cultural issue that, can damage trust or creativity or performance. And how did we get here? I mean, there could be several different factors at play. It could be a fear of failure or mistakes. If people believe that errors will lead to blame, embarrassment, or even job loss, they'll avoid taking risks or admitting uncertainty. It could be due to a top-down authoritarian leadership approach as well. I mean, leaders who rely on control or fear or micromanagement unintentionally create environments where employees feel unsafe to speak up. Or the company may lack diversity or fail to truly include different perspectives, so employees may not feel safe being themselves or challenging the status quo or sharing ideas. And I often see that in organizations where communication is siloed or non-transparent, employees often don't feel heard. So if feedback is discouraged or ignored, then they stop offering it.
Isn't that true? I mean, nobody wants to feel embarrassed or humiliated. Nobody wants to step out of line or be, the person that rocks the boat. I totally get what you're saying. When employees stay silent, though, following what, they feel like they're supposed to do or what they have to do, companies pay a price. So how does that kind of self-censorship affect innovation or team trust or even overall performance in the organization?
When employees stay silent, whether that's out of fear or distrust or feeling unheard, the cost to the organization is significant. Innovation suffers because new ideas, opinions, creative risks never make it to the table. Some of the best solutions often come from challenging the status quo or brainstorming ideas. And if people don't feel safe doing that, companies miss out on that critical thinking. And I feel like it also just erodes team trust. Silence can create a false sense of harmony, right? You may think everything's okay because you're not hearing anything, but underneath, issues go unspoken and resentment can really build over time. And that damages collaboration and psychological safety. And from a performance standpoint, self censorship can lead to disengagement. So people stop going above and beyond when they feel their voice doesn't matter. So that affects performance. And we saw this with the client we worked with recently in our Up Your Culture program. We saw that in their culture and engagement survey data and comments that employees didn't feel heard and they didn't feel like they had a voice or could share ideas or ask questions. So one of the things we did was help them plan town hall meetings to share information and, more importantly, answer employee questions. Leaders shared that this town hall meeting went great, but when we did their next culture and engagement surveys, all their scores actually went down, and people still felt unheard. So after meeting with leaders again to understand what happened, they shared that they did the town hall meeting, but they didn't have time for employee questions, so they left Q&A out of it entirely. There was no two-way communication. They didn't get feedback or questions from employees, and that did even more damage. It lowered employee engagement.
I remember that. I remember that so well. And it's really interesting because you and I work for an organization that is so transparent. We do regular state of the state meetings where all of our numbers are put on the table. I mean, there's really nothing that we as employees don't know. So we're so accustomed to that transparency and that two-way conversation. There's no question you can't ask. And so when that happened, I remember so clearly the employer, the leaders in that organization, they were so proud that they had had this town hall meeting and they had shared their survey data. That was a huge step, just even letting people know what the survey data said. But boy, what a miss, because you're exactly right. It was a lecture. It was here are the numbers we want to show you. Don't ask me any questions. I don't want to talk about anything that I didn't already prepare. And and their numbers went down. Mm-hmm. Great example. And that really leads into our next question, which is about people feeling like their thoughts and opinions and questions really matter. So our Engage 2025 data showed that only 38% of employees felt as though their opinions matter to their company, to their leaders. So what does it take to go beyond just listening to actually creating a culture where people feel like their input genuinely shapes the organization? They are part of the collective voice.
Yeah, I mean, listening is so important, but it's really only the starting point, isn't it? I mean, to build a culture where people feel their input genuinely shapes the organization, I would say leaders need to move past passive listening to active listening, or active inclusion, I would even say. The first step is definitely asking employees for their thoughts and opinions. Then employees need to see that their input leads to decisions, changes, or follow-up. If feedback disappears into a black hole, then people stop sharing. So even if the answer is not right now, we can't do that right now, you can still communicate what happens next, what the next steps are, and that transparency builds trust. It's also important to involve employees early in decisions that affect them. So whether it's company policies, tools and resources, workflows, or even culture initiatives. This starts with creating systems where employee voices are regularly gathered and acted on. And that could be through surveys, listening tours, getting feedback tied to strategic planning, or co-creating solutions with cross-functional teams. And you can also make listening part of everyday leadership by asking questions like, what do you think? Or what's missing here in meetings? Getting into the regular habit of that and then taking action on what you learn.
I love that. So the question and answer we were talking about earlier is sort of the low bar, just opening up the floor. That's low bar. And then if I'm hearing you correctly, on top of that, there needs to be action taken. there needs to be communication about the action taken, and it needs to be a regular thing. It can't just be at the state of the state meeting or whatever. It has to be every leader all the time. What do you think? Taking action, communicating on it. I'm just putting everything you're saying into the context of that one client, thinking, man, that would change everything. Everything. Great, great advice. So the report highlights a really big disconnect. And this is a theme that we saw throughout the entire report, something we actually kind of stopped down on. But there's a big difference between how people at the top of the organization feel and how others feel. So executives seem to feel heard, but most frontline employees do not feel heard. So how can leaders close that communication gap? How can they make sure every level of the organization feels seen and heard and valued?
That disconnect where executives feel heard, but frontline employees don't, I think is one of the most common and damaging gaps in organizational culture. I mean, those with power and proximity to decision making are heard, while others are left out of the conversation entirely. So closing that gap is so important to building a truly inclusive, high-performing organization. And the main strategy I would suggest here is to shift from top-down to two-way communication. Replacing one-way updates, like we talked about, like in that town hall meeting, with ongoing conversations through Q&A sessions, open forums, town halls, where employees can ask hard questions without fear. They can really give their feedback and ask questions that are important to them and get answers. Even if you can't give an answer at the moment, you can let them know you'll circle back and you'll get them the information and kind of close that loop.
Let's talk about leadership vulnerability. So how does a leader's willingness to admit mistakes, to ask questions because they really don't know, or to seek feedback, get opinions of others, how does that set the tone for open and honest communication throughout their team or the organization?
That's huge. I think leadership vulnerability is one of the most powerful tools for building trust and open communication. Because when a leader is willing to admit mistakes, ask questions, or seek feedback, it sends a clear message. Like, it's safe to be honest here. It shows that perfection isn't the expectation, but growth is. I've seen that firsthand, how this encourages others to speak up. It encourages people to share ideas or raise concerns without fear. And it sets the tone that feedback is not just welcome, it's valued. When leaders model curiosity instead of I know everything attitude, it shifts the culture from one of performance to one of learning. And that's where I think innovation, collaboration, and engagement really take off. In my experience, the most respected leaders aren't the ones who have all the answers and know everything. They're the ones who are open enough to keep asking better questions.
Yeah, we use Microsoft as an example. I know in one of our Up Your Culture workshops, and we talked about how when their new CEO came in years ago, how they changed it from a know-it-all culture to a learn-it-all culture. And that's what I'm hearing you saying. Like the goal is the learning and the exploring, not the perfectionism. It sounds like you two have a lot in common. So quiet doesn't always mean content. I know that. How can managers tell the difference between an employee who is quietly productive, quietly engaged, and one who's quietly disengaged or quietly fearful to speak up or, raise a warning flag?
Yeah, so true that quiet doesn't always mean content. I think it's important not to assume that silence equals satisfaction. A quietly productive employee often shows signs of ownership and a sense of responsibility. So they meet deadlines, ask thoughtful questions in one-on-ones, and contribute in ways that align with their natural working style. But somebody who's disengaged or fearful may withdraw from conversations, avoid taking initiative, or show changes in behavior like reduced communication or enthusiasm. So the key is building trust through regular check-ins that can really help. I mean, not just to talk about tasks, but to ask deeper questions like, what's been energizing to you lately? Or what's been frustrating to you lately? And that space helps uncover what the silence really means. And when you consistently show that it's safe to speak up, people are more likely to come forward before that disengagement turns into turnover.
What a great concept to actually ask the question, ask people how they're feeling and, what their engagement level is like. I like that. So collaboration and conflict resolution were a couple of things that were also called out in this report as areas that need major improvement. It looks like employees, actually at all levels, we heard people saying that collaboration was an issue, conflict resolution was an issue. I think that probably communication, like what we're talking about, can help here. What are some practical ways that our listeners can foster open dialogue, even when maybe the conversations are hard?
Yeah, having open dialogue, especially in times of conflict, starts with creating that psychological safety and modeling healthy communication. One of the most practical things I found is setting clear expectations for how to communicate as a team, right? Things like assuming positive intent, removing judgment, separating the idea from the person, and prioritizing listening over reacting. And that's a really important one because sometimes it's hard not to react in the moment, but not reacting in the moment and really asking questions and listening. And these ground rules help create a foundation where disagreement isn't seen as a threat, but as a pathway to better outcomes. But when things do get tough, I believe in slowing down the conversation, talking about what's causing the tension, asking clarifying questions, and giving space for all voices to be heard. And then one-on-one check-ins can also help uncover concerns that people might not feel safe raising in a group setting, but definitely being productive and proactive and not avoiding conflict because we all know it can get worse if you avoid it.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Assuming positive intent is not always easy, especially when people have low morale, when there's some toxicity in the workplace. That's hard. Great idea to have some private one-on-one conversations. Really smart way to get people to maybe bring things to light that they wouldn't otherwise. So for leaders who worry that silence may be costing them more than they realize, what's one bold, meaningful step that you would recommend they take just to open up the lines of communication a little bit?
I would say start by asking powerful questions. I'll go back to asking questions to get the communication flowing. I think one step you can take is to ask team members directly a question like, what's something you think but haven't felt safe to say? I mean, this can be really powerful, but the key is not just asking, it's how you respond. You have to listen without defensiveness, thank people for their honesty, and follow up with action or transparency about what's possible and what's next. I feel like creating space for candor requires courage. It's not easy, but when you share things with your people first, admitting a blind spot, owning a past mistake, or saying, I know I haven't always made it easy to speak up, but I want to change that, it sets the tone for trust. And I think that one moment can open the door to better communication.
I love that. That gives me goosebumps, just the vulnerability of that. And I think you've made such a point that leaders need to be vulnerable. They need to be open. They need to put themselves out there a little bit. I also really heard you say in multiple ways, they need to act upon what they heard. They need to demonstrate that they didn't just, welcome the conversation at the moment, but they really heard, valued, and took action on that content. love everything that you shared, and I knew I would. So thank you for joining. Thank you for reminding us that a quiet team is not always a healthy team. That's good for, I think, all of our listeners to really think about and digest. Loved this discussion. If it's okay with you, I'd love to include your LinkedIn information in the show notes. I would imagine. Is that all right?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Good. A lot of people probably want to connect with you, reach out. We'll also include a link to the Engage 2025 report so listeners can dig in more to all of the data that we discussed today. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in and for considering how to up your culture. Thanks so much for spending time with us on Culture Over Coffee. If you enjoyed the conversation, be sure to subscribe and join us for every episode. For more helpful information about company culture and employee engagement, visit us at upyourculture.com.